Good morning. Alan Skinner here. This presentation discusses my findings of research conducted in the Oxford Scholarship online database, where I found two useful research works. The first is J.G. Fuller's chapter, Organization of the British and Dominion Forces. Fuller, who's listed as a lecturer of the Civil Service College of London, appears to have used many primary sources, war journals, and newspaper articles for creating his work. He describes in broad terms the organization of the British and Dominion armies for the Great War. Unlike the other great powers, Britain had no National Conscription Act, relying solely on volunteers to fill vacancies in the ranks. As a consequence, the British experienced a manpower crisis when many of the regulars were killed and wounded in the opening stages of the war. As a result, the British had to mobilize their Dominion forces and then also organize new voluntary units organized on a regional basis. One intended consequence of this regional recruiting was that many small towns suffered disproportionate losses as a result of the Battle of the Somme in July 1916. And as a consequence, fewer men were willing to volunteer for service. So the British blatantly started conscription and nationalized their army by stopping this practice of regional recruiting and assignments. Although effective in raw manpower terms, Fuller notes, these policies impacted efficiency and morale because there was a deep sense of mistrust between the conscripts, the veteran volunteers, and then both groups resented the shabby treatment at the hands of the regulars occupying leadership positions. So the Americans theoretically had the benefit of watching and learning from these mistakes, but few lessons were learned as the United States entered the Great War with a very ill-prepared army. One thing the Americans did get right was they learned from the British failure to manage manpower. So acts in 1916 and 17 laid the legal basis for a wartime draft, which began in May of that year. After the armistice, Secretary of War Newton Baker affirmed the soundness of the draft, noting how it had successfully expanded the peacetime army of 200,000 men to a wartime army of almost 3.8 million men. The second reviewed work is Christopher Capozzola's chapter in the United States Empire in the books Empires at War. He's a professor of history at MIT and appears to have used manuscript and scholarly essay sources for his chapter. He begins with an intriguing research approach by examining America's military involvement in policing its new colonial holdings, which were gained as a result of the Spanish-American War. To police all these holdings, the regular army had to station about 10% of its total manpower in places like the Philippines and Panama. So when war was declared in April 1917, this constabulary army was drawn down to organize the American Expeditionary Force with leaders that at least had some field experience, albeit skirmishes against insurgents. Among many of the AEF leaders that had served in the Philippines was General John J. Pershing, who had served 2 tours there. Capozzola asserts, though, that these small unit and small wars experiences did not influence the American officers, and he backs up his assertion only by noting the lack of Philippine references in Pershing's memoirs. This assertion is contradicted by Army historian Stephen Lofgren's work on American unpreparedness, and he notes specifically how Pershing's experiences with leading cavalry patrols in the Philippines instilled the importance of aggressive maneuver and accurate rifle fire in winning battlefield engagements. So first, I plan to use Fuller's work to compare and contrast pre-war British and American recruiting policies, particularly concerning the organization of the voluntary units, because the British employed regional recruiting, and that's something that the Americans employed also, organizing the National Army divisions in a specific region. So I plan to look for some of those connections in my own research. Secondly, Fuller highlights the tensions between regulars, volunteers, and conscripts, and that provides another potential line of inquiry. Capozzola's work offers a useful line of inquiry in analyzing the social history of the 81st Division. My preliminary research indicates many of the officers were regulars, and I plan to look to see how many of them had service in the Philippines, and then if so, how did that Philippine service translate into their wartime service in France? Well, thank you for your time. This concludes my presentation.